Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today's episode is about the pain of being ahead of your time. And the reason I brought up this episode title or topic is because the many of you who either I've worked with, I've spoken to, or I connect with are generally living ahead of their time, living beyond the cultural center of gravity. So in today's episode, I wanted to actually introduce this concept of cultural center of gravity because many of you are living beyond the cultural center of gravity, but you aren't aware of this concept. And more importantly, you aren't aware of the implications of this concept. And also the pains of what it means to live beyond the cultural center of gravity. So what do I mean exactly by living beyond the cultural center of gravity or being ahead of your time? Many of you, especially those who are interested in naturopathic health and functional medicine and showing up in different ways in your life, in profound emotional connection with your friends and ideally even family members, many of us are not getting our needs met. We're not really actually being met where we want to be met by those around us, but also by society at large. And it's easy to fall into this trap of thinking that something is wrong with you, that you're meant to be alone, that you're introverted, when in reality, your tribe just isn't there yet. You aren't surrounded by your tribe. And that could be a problem in a small town, in a country where things are just not as progressive, but it's even a problem for me living in New York City at times. So, we're going to go through this idea of cultural center of gravity, where it comes from. There's a couple helpful frameworks and theoretical lenses through which to help us cope with being ahead of our times, but also kind of make the best of it as well. Yeah. And then create a framework for actually bringing others along for the ride to move beyond the cultural center of gravity and to do that in a compassionate and gentle way. So before we actually get into the meat, so to speak, of today, I want to actually go through this quote that just absolutely rattles me to my core. Your new life is going to cost you your old one. It's going to cost you your comfort zone and your sense of direction. It's going to cost you being liked and understood. But the people that are meant for you will meet you on the other side. Instead of being liked, you'll be loved. You'll be everything you're supposed to be and leave the old you behind. Wow. Every time I read it, it just really touches my soul on a deep level. Many of us are closeted to some degree, closeted in your spirituality, closeted in terms of your dedication to your health and wellness, closeted, in terms of your greatness as a whole. And many of us get by in the world by playing small, especially those of us that are a little bit more empath, that we were told when we were kids that who we were was wrong, that your eccentricity and quote unquote weirdness or individuality wasn't welcome to some degree. Many of us, including myself, I developed a coping mechanism of going along with the crowd, not voicing my opinion, staying small in order to appease others, to really be at their level. What this quote really tells me is that the courage that each of us individually takes on to really, do that undertaking of stepping out and showing up fully as you is really giving each of us more freedom. As each one of us liberates ourselves, we are creating the permission slip for others to do the same. And then collectively, we are going to create the new earth. If you're listening to this podcast, if you're interested in a lot of the topics that I cover, you are undoubtedly part of this new earth. So that was that. I just wanted to lay that foundation because we're going to go into some slightly heady stuff. And I want to really keep it embodied. I want to keep it at the soul level because that's what this is all about, is really just embodiment and really that moment to moment state of consciousness each day, not holding on to these concepts, these symbols, right? Okay. So the first thing to note is that if you feel misunderstood by your environment, if you are kind of a little bit beyond the cultural center of gravity, you most likely came to this life to be a way shower. You are here to point others towards their own greatness, towards a way of life that is actually possible for them. If they could suspend disbelief, if they would open their mind, if they could see possibilities beyond the smallness and the, I don't want to say mediocrity, but just the conformity that they've become accustomed to. They have been asleep. And so as a way shower, you are in the spotlight, whether, I'm very introverted, but just by virtue of the way you live, the way you show up, the things you say, even if it's with very few words, you are a way shower. You are here as part of this movement to really propel humanity forward in a deep way. So, and what are we talking about here as a way shower? There are a couple key frameworks. There's one called Suzanne Cook-Greuter's Stages of Ego Development. I highly recommend, it's an openly published paper. You can find the PDF. Highly recommend taking a look at her work. The other is going to be spiral dynamics. And there's a couple really good videos and books on spiral dynamics that I will link in the show notes or in the description, depending on where you are watching this. And so the cultural center of gravity is basically the default mode of consciousness of most people. And what does that really mean in practice? Well, every society, city, and country kind of has a default level of consciousness. And basically, each level of consciousness ideally include and transcends the other. So each level of development is valuable and it has things that you need to learn. One of the traps is moving from one level to the other without integrating the lessons from the previous one. I'm not going to make this into a video on spiral dynamics or a podcast on spiral dynamics, but the 3, possibly 4, that are the most pertinent for those listening to this podcast and for the year 2024, which is where we're in, are stage blue, stage orange, and stage green, possibly stage yellow. Stage blue represents the traditionalist worldview. This is more collectivist in nature. For example, communities like the more conservative Arab communities tend to be in this level of consciousness. Evangelical Christians tend to be in a blend of this plus modernism. Hasidic Jewish communities. So this is kind of one level of consciousness that still exists in the world today. This is why there is religious fundamentalism in American politics. And a lot of the reasons it's very hard for a contemporary progressive living in a big city to really understand religious fundamentalism is because they fundamentally don't understand where this worldview comes from and what this state of consciousness really is. So that's number 1. Number 2 is going to be stage orange. This is highly individualistic. This is modernism. This is where we're moving into secularism, where we move from praising religion to praising science, rationality, and reason. This obviously started in the West with the Enlightenment, where we started to move away from religion dominating daily life. And now we've gotten to a place where, depending on where you live and many other factors, but secularism is sort of the religion of the day, and specifically scientific materialism. So even for those people that are religious, they go to church, they have a faith of sorts, religion doesn't dominate daily modern life in developed countries to the same extent that it did before. So today people, for example, worship doctors, experts, scientists, anything that can be quantified in the external material world. This is why people, like, once again, if you're listening to this podcast, maybe you're into Kundalini yoga, you're into psychedelics, you may be into working with your chakras, things like your pranayama, doing breath work. This is very out of reach for many scientifically materialistic minded people. I'm sure that we all have friends that are maybe into fitness, running, weightlifting, or they're very career oriented, and they won't do anything unless it's backed by evidence. A podcast such as the Andrew Huberman podcast, which is a great source of evidence-backed protocols in many ways, is sort of a byproduct or manifestation of our reverence for scientific materialism. So we won't believe something until there are studies from a reputable institution like UCLA or Berkeley in order to back it up. And so that's kind of, where a lot of, I would say the bulk of our society is at. And the third stage that I think is most relevant is going to be stage green. This is postmodernism. One thing I forgot to mention about stage orange is that it really is the capitalistic stage, late stage capitalism. And this is basically, we were reaching the limits of stage orange, just like we reached the limits of stage blue, which is how the Enlightenment happened, is that we got to a point, this is the transformational dilemma, where we simply said, look, enough is enough. I'm tired of being bossed around by priests, by the church, being told what to do. And there was a very deep repression in society because religion doesn't include a lot of people. And it can be very repressive for certain groups of people that want to live life in a different way. We're reaching that state with stage orange right now, which is where people are waking up that late stage capitalism doesn't work for a lot of people. Why do we have to work 40, 50, 60 hours a week and spend zero time with our friends and loved ones and just be in this constant loop of being exploited by companies, having our dopamine pathways exploited by advertising companies, and having our wallets drained to buy things we don't need? Even the wellness industry is deeply entrenched in stage orange. So a lot of healing professionals, a lot of doctors, a lot of people selling products that are ostensibly good for you, they do it in ways that are actually deeply toxic to the human mind and even our nervous systems. So we're getting to a point where stage orange is starting to break down, and we're seeing the emergence of something new. In larger cities, people are awakening to postmodernism. Of course, one of the traps of postmodernism is that if you just jump into it without integrating the lessons from stage orange, because there's a lot of great things about stage orange, like discipline, rigor, organization, leveraging science in a powerful and context appropriate way is very beneficial for our society at large. If we just start doing energy work and everyone becomes a star seed and everything's relativistic, then things start to break down in many areas, many domains of life. This is actually going to be very counterproductive. So stage green is starting to represent something new, which is the emphasis of emotions. It's becoming more interoceptive about not so much worrying about what's going on out there, but also realizing that there's an entire reality baked inside of us into our cells. This is where mental health is becoming a priority. People's emotional well-being is starting to become prioritized. People are actually doing things like men's groups, retreats. The idea that meditation is a worthwhile activity of doing nothing, being overdoing. This is pretty unfathomable to someone who is very squarely in stage orange. They would not understand why you would go on a silent meditation retreat. They wouldn't understand why you would do breath work to remove trapped emotions lodged in your tissues. They don't understand the value of deep psychedelic experiences. They don't understand why you would want to help victimized groups because they have a zero-sum view of the world. So now we're moving into stage green, and a lot of things like climate change activism, helping out underprivileged portions of our society, working on ourselves, prioritizing self-care, this idea that we work to live and not the other way around. And so there's a lot of memes and videos out there making fun of millennials and Gen Z for the way that they work. That's largely because most people in Gen X and beyond are pretty stage orange. They don't embody a lot of the wisdom of stage green or growing up in a world that was a little bit more tolerant towards stage green values. The limitation with each of these is that they are usually context unaware. So in other words, they don't understand that they are in a stage at all, and that this stage is relative to the way that they construct reality, to their worldview, and they mistake their perspective or their level of consciousness with absolute truth, when it isn't absolute truth. It's simply one way of constructing reality, which is why we have culture wars, which is why we have very toxic political challenges, which is why you have very liberal, progressive people behaving in hateful, violent ways, is because they simply cannot fathom how somebody could take on a traditionalist worldview, or even a modernist worldview for that matter. They mistake their perspective for reality. And each until you get to stage yellow, which is construct aware. They are aware that all of these are just constructs, and there's a little bit more compassion towards each of them, maybe even a possibility of speaking to each one in a way that resonates with them and kind of bringing them up the ladder, proverbial ladder, so to speak. So that's kind of the issues there. So those are the three kind of levels of consciousness that I think are most relevant for today. There's some other stages that are above, all the way to awakening, satori, pure enlightenment, etc. But this is important because most of the time we think about enlightenment and awakening and consciousness in terms of being asleep and in terms of being awake. A lot of spiritual teachers do this, including someone like Eckhart Tolle, Thich Nhat Hanh, others. And I think that we're doing people a disservice by not distinguishing between the various levels of consciousness that exist, and that you could go up those rungs within a lifetime, especially if you are aware of them. So just to get things a little bit more personal, I grew up in a household that was identified as being Catholic. My family isn't particularly religious. They just kind of went through the motions of doing the sacraments and just a typical Hispanic family living in the States. I would say that they were much more of a stage orange family that had hints of stage blue. They had some of the values, conditioning, borderline brainwashing of the, Catholic Hispanic worldview. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about here. And there's some limitations. Some of those limitations are they're a little bit more conservative in terms of how people look, how people should show up, what constitutes a good person versus a bad person. They judge heavily on appearances. If you're gay or part of the LGBTQ community at all, you're probably not so welcome. It's a little bit shameful. So in my case, I grew up, and around the age of 8 or so, I started to question this whole Catholic narrative that was bestowed upon me. Something didn't really seem right about it. The world that I lived in my immediate direct experience, really didn't align with the story of God and Jesus. And so early on, I started to really kind of rebel against this and effectively take on a secular atheistic worldview. I ended up not going to a religious high school, and kind of into college started studying philosophy and started practicing yoga around 18 and exposing myself to Buddhism and Eastern traditions that more aligned with the way I was thinking. But really, I moved into scientific materialism in a very big way, very secular, atheistic, kind of in the Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens type of camp. And at some point, this was great. I was kind of one of these semi-gothic philosopher types that smoked cigarettes and stuff. And I realized that there was a huge vacuum in my life. There was not a very deep understanding of suffering, how to cope with life's challenges. There was a vacuum of spirituality. When I got sick in my early to mid 20s, I started returning back to my roots in terms of yoga. So around the age of 18, I was exposed to yoga, and that kind of brought me back into meditation and Buddhism and spirituality and a lot of these kind of new age stage green type of things like ecstatic dance, somatic healing, etc. So all of that is to simply say is that there's a limit and a ceiling to each of these states of consciousness and stages of development, and you will outgrow them at some point. The cultural center of gravity, once again, is always moving forward. There's just a kind of a pain point for us these days is that we're almost like those in the Enlightenment age that we're using scientific studies, reasoning, that we didn't just rely on gospel to explain the universe. And I think that's a helpful reframe for a lot of us that are feeling lonely, that are feeling unseen, not finding our tribe, is that we are pioneers. We're living beyond the cultural center of gravity. But that doesn't change the emotional experience, the moment-to-moment experience of being someone that is shepherding people towards the new earth. Some of the things that, I've experienced are loneliness. And I think loneliness hits the hardest when it's really in your own family or relationships where you really don't feel in community in the places you should feel most in community. So I think that loneliness can be very real, especially if you're in a relationship where you're with someone who does not have a spiritual practice, does not think about their health in the same terms, does not have a connection to spirit. So go ahead and drop a comment if that's you, if you relate to that experience of not having that community. So that's very real. The other thing is, I very rarely use this word, but of kind of being gaslit or people just dismissing you. So when you speak your truth about connecting with spirit guides, about your full moon ceremony, about the state of consciousness that fasting puts you in, and some people try and just pigeonhole it into a very scientific materialist type of explanation where they want to understand ketones and neurotransmitters and stuff like that, which there's nothing wrong with. I definitely incorporate that as well. This whole idea that like your truth and your explanations are not being validated. That's a very real thing as being someone that lives beyond the cultural center of gravity. And then that causes you to sort of live in the closet, doing your meditations and visualizations alone, going on your solo retreats and feeling like, okay, well, maybe there is no tribe for me. Maybe this is just par for the course. You know, another symptom that I've come across is having to set boundaries around normal things. As a way shower, as someone who's beyond the cultural center of gravity, in this case, probably someone who is in the stage green, bleeding into stage yellow with a more evolved practice, someone who's committed to personal growth and evolution, you live your life in a different way. You're not prioritizing going out for cocktails with friends. You're eating foods that maybe other people don't eat. You're engaging in practices that are, these rituals don't exist in our society at all. So many times you have to set these boundaries around things that are essential for your well-being, for your nourishment, whether that be that full moon ceremony, where that boundary for how long your intermittent fast is, for your long breathwork practice, or anything else to really nourish you. And that's something that I've definitely struggled with is, you know, setting those boundaries and making them normalized, because it's very easy to like just fall into that agreeable pattern and just be agreeable for others. So that's definitely a very real challenge, I would say. So all of that is to say, you know, so where do we go from here, right? So you're living beyond the cultural center of gravity. You have this language now. How do you consciously bring people into this? How do you find your tribe? Number one is the belief, believing that you can find your tribe, incorporating this into your visualizations, and actually be more open about how you feel, dropping that comment, and you'd be surprised. There are some other closeted weirdos. There are some closeted spiritual people out there. Even speaking to those that you can tell are at a different level of consciousness than you. For example, speaking to a religious person in terms of using their language, saying the word God, but actually speaking your truth. Seeing how they react. Seeing someone who maybe they would think is secular or indifferent towards spiritual practice, but knowing that you know what level they're at, being able to speak to them and invite them into your practice, maybe bringing them along for this possibility that spiritual practice can be something deeper than what happens inside of a church or in a temple. That the church and temple is really all around us. We're living and breathing it every day. In terms of bringing people along, I think that's the first step, is just being open about it, setting those boundaries, normalizing these things in your relationships. And then, of course, finding your tribe. This is a proactive process. It's sort of a part-time job. You kind of have to look for it, whether it be looking for events, finding some community, some sangha. And I think this is one of the problems with the wellness, the healing and wellness industries in this stage orange environment, is that everything is done individual. So healing, spirituality, personal growth is largely done in this one-on-one individual aspect. And as a result, many of us are very lonely because we've really ripped out the communal aspect of healing practices. There's a time and place to do things alone for sure, and not everything has to be done in a circle. But I do think that most people are really doing themselves a disservice by not at least trying to have a community that is aligned with their level of consciousness. And then lastly is like, how do we continue the evolution? This one's a little bit harder because life brings you its lessons. And I think it's hard to deliberately evolve your consciousness at times. I think the first step is really knowing the stages, understanding where you're at. What are the traps that you fall into? Because you undoubtedly fall into those traps, whether it be judgment of the other stages, lack of acceptance of other people who are not spiritual, and knowing where you want to go. What are the things that you need to embody in order to continue to evolve The point of evolution is not to just get to some metric like stage yellow or stage turquoise, but rather to expand your own state of consciousness and being so that your moment to moment experience imbues with more love and ease, and you're able to show up in the most powerful way possible. So I'm going to kind of cap it at that for today. This was sort of an impromptu podcast. I wanted to share this concept of cultural center of gravity and what it means for people who are beyond it. You're a way shower. You came here for a reason, and you are so deeply powerful. And I'm so grateful that you're here showing the way to others. If you have any comments, questions, any resources that you would like, go ahead and drop me a comment if you're watching this on YouTube. And otherwise, I will leave everything in the show notes. Go ahead and like and subscribe. Share this with anyone that you think would benefit. Much love to each of you. Sat Nam.